I'm here to talk about renovating old buildings. I used to be a historic building consultant, which meant I told people how to deal with, look after, renovate, improve, everything to do with old buildings, how they work. Now I have one of my own. I bought a very run-down house in Devon 3 years ago, and I've been working on that ever since. What I'm talking about is what we've been doing online. It's the best way to demonstrate what you can do and hopefully how you can do it in the best way possible. How are you going to decide whether it's a viable project? If it's the right project for you, is it a doable house in the first place? To be able to actually get the most out of it, you really have to understand how old buildings work, understand the nature of the fabric of the building, so that what you do to it is actually going to be for the benefit of the building rather than actually working against it, which people did an awful lot in the past and look at some of the problems that's caused. Consents, planning permission, list of building consent, and also in design, how to get the best out of design for old buildings. And then we'll look at some details to our staircases, walls, ceilings, floors, updating all of the services of buildings, fitting out the interior, and then very importantly, at the end, we'll look at thermal performance, how old buildings do perform and how you can try to improve the thermal performance of your building. So how do you assess a renovation project? You can start off with a lovely building, dig century, timber frames, cottage in Oxfordshire. The things you've got to be looking at really are obviously the condition of the building. Is it repairable? If it is what's involved and required something which you can manage within just terms of the actual amount of workload, the cost of it, the time, the implications on your life of actually taking it on? Does what the building needs suit what you're able to give it, what you want to do? And there's kind of cost-benefit analysis. Obviously, you've got to consider how much it's going to cost. And there's a basic financial transaction in terms of how that will reflect in the value at the end of the project. But that's not the only benefit. Very often that's not the reason people are renovating buildings. They've got to create your own forever home, and the benefit is what you're going to get out of it. And it may be that that's not a straight financial transaction. It could be you'll put more into it and it's going to be worth it in the end. But that's worth it for you. But it's how that stacks up for your own personal viewpoint. What potential does it have? What can you do to improve this building and create the building you want to get out of it? And then what restrictions are they going to be trying to stop you doing that potentially? In terms of the fabric of the building, obviously planning restrictions, list of building controls, all those kind of things. There's this intangible thing, the character of old building. How are you going to enhance, improve, develop the character of the building, build some more character back into the building, which may well have been lost in the past? It's one of those things which everyone kind of recognises, but it's very difficult to define. If you're going to have anything to do with old buildings, you need to understand this. Modern buildings, everything we've built today is built with vapour barriers, damp-proof membranes, impermeable materials. Everything is all around keeping water out of the structure and making everything very solid and rigid. Old buildings are almost the complete opposite. You can't keep water out of the fabric of an old building. They're built out of permeable materials which are very soft. There are no damp-proof courses. Their foundations are just stuck in the wet ground. It's in their nature to soak up water. But what happens is when they soak up that water, because they're permeable buildings, there are lots of paths of evaporation for all the moisture within the building. So it loses that water after it's evaporated, after it's absorbed it. And it lives in this kind of cycle of constant absorption and evaporation, which works really well. We've been building like this for, and we know, at least 10,000 years. I've regularly worked on buildings which are 500, 600, 700 years old. Until you start to mess with this system, it works very well. There's nothing we're building now which is still going to be around in 700 years' time. It's a really good way of building. It's very robust and very solid. The way it works is there's lots of moisture all around the building trying to get into it. So you have water in the ground trying to come up through the building. If you have permeable floors, it can evaporate through the floors into the internal space of the building. In the foundations, water rises up the foundations into the permeable fabric of the walls, and it can then evaporate both outside and inside, and that equilibrium keeps the building relatively dry. It rains, the permeable fabric soaks up the rain, and then the sun comes out, the wind blows, and it all dries out of it. Inside the building, just by living in it, you create a huge amount of moisture. Just people breathing, cooking, cleaning, having showers and baths and so on. And all of that moisture has to go somewhere. And the permeable fabric can absorb that, and then when there's good ventilation and when the airflow is dry, it all evaporates out again and it's cleared out of the building. As I say, it works really, really well. Until someone comes along, as it nearly always did in the 20th century, and says, oh, well, we don't want to have water evaporating up to our floor, we'll put a nice concrete floor in, probably with a plastic membrane underneath. So all that groundwater rising up through the ground, it now hits a solid barrier. It has to go somewhere because it's under a fair amount of pressure, so it squirts out sideways into the base of the walls, and the base of the walls start to get a bit damp. You see the inside of the base of the walls is getting a bit damp and probably a bit of staining coming up on them, and so they get quite worried. So you call in a bloke who calls himself a damp proofing contractor, and he'll inject a completely useless injected damp-proof course into the base of your walls, and then line the inside of the walls with water-retaining plaster to stop the damp in the walls coming through where you can see it. All that's doing is hiding the problem. It's blocking that internal route of evaporation. So you've got all the water going up into the walls, less of it can get out, so they get a bit damper. So now the outside of the walls is looking quite damp around the edges. So they say, I know what we'll do, we'll coat the whole thing in a cement render. That will stop the water getting in. It won't. So we've got a very rigid cement render on a very flexible building. So the cement cracks, water gets into the cracks, and now it can't get out. Also, all the groundwater coming up can't evaporate either outside or inside, so the walls are gradually filling up with more and more water, and the house is getting damper and damper. Now, damp walls are cold. Wet fabric transfers heat much better than dry fabric. So now you've got a cold damp wall, and all of that moisture you're creating inside will start condensing on the cold surfaces. Probably someone's replaced the lime plaster with modern either cement or gypsum plaster, so it can't absorb all of that condensation either. And you start getting condensation visibly on the walls, and that promotes black mold growth, which is very harmful for human health, causes respiratory illnesses and so on. So you've now got a building which is unhealthy, which is now also making the inhabitants unhealthy as well. And this happens a lot. I've seen tons and tons of buildings like this, and some of them buildings which I would walk into and my eyes would start streaming and my throat would start to get stringy because there's so many mold spores in there. And the people living there have kind of got conditioned to it and they don't realise that's what's happening to them. So there are quite serious effects of mismanaging buildings like this. If there's timber in the building, it will start to rot, and you get really serious problems. Now, as well as facilitating all the breathability of the building and making it possible for water to get into the building to evaporate, you need to give it a helping hand as well. Rainwater hitting the building is the main source of water, and the main protection against that is the rainwater goods, the gutters and downpipes and so on in your house. Very often, I would say in 2/3 of the houses I've surveyed, there are major problems with the rainwater goods. Even a really small leak, say in the joint of a gutter, produces an amazing amount of water. And it can be quite difficult to see small leaks. Just a little drip every now and again. Sometimes it's just a trickle running down a downpipe and so on. But if you put a 10-litre bucket underneath a single drip from a junction in a gutter, you'll find it will fill up when it's raining in about an hour. That's the kind of volumes of water we're talking about. Here, most buildings I look at, nowadays the gutters are too small. Even if they were fine in the past, because of climate change and the extreme rainfall events we're having these days, most gutters which were okay in the past tend to get overwhelmed sometimes. So whenever we're changing gutters now, we're oversizing them and making them bigger. You almost can't have your gutters too big. There are very large volumes of water that you need to collect to get away from your building. The fact that this gutter is plastic as well as too small is the next problem. PVC doesn't perform very well in UV light, which makes it a far from ideal material for to have stuck on the outside of your house. Because they're black, as well as the PVC degrading and UV, there's a lot of expansion and contraction all the time, every time the sun comes out and goes behind a cloud and so on, and that weakens it as well. My house is thatched, so we don't have gutters. Instead, the thatch slows down the water running off the roof and has a massive overhang as well, so what does drip down is thrown well away from the building, so it's a different way of protecting it. but we did have a horrible cement render on the upper part of the building, which was a significant issue we will have to deal with. Inside that roof, roofs are a great way of assessing a building to see what kind of state it might be in, because no one changes the roof unless they have a good reason to. In the part of the house you live in, every generation, probably multiple times even within generations, people will have changed things and altered things for convenience, for fashion, just because there were new technological things they could put into their house. There are lots and lots of changes. So the living area has been constantly messed around with throughout the history of the building. In the roof, you don't go up there. There's no reason to change anything unless you think there's a problem. So I look into this roof space and I think something has happened here, because there's a fairly major intervention. All of this timber isn't supposed to be there. And it tells me two things. First of all, there was apparently a problem with that roof at some time in the past. And the person who tried to fix it was an idiot who didn't know what he was doing. It could be there was never a problem. Very often people perceive problems in old fabric which don't exist. It doesn't look nice and straight and square as they were expecting it to. So actually he might have created a problem which was never there. Or there may have been a major structural issue which he tried to fix. But I'm also thinking, what's he done to the rest of the building while he was doing this? So before I had anything to do with that building, I would want to have a very good look at it all the way through, because I'm very suspicious now, because someone has been messing about with it in a way which I don't like. So consents, design and planning are a major issue in terms of getting stuff done in old buildings, especially as they're listed. And the chances are, if you're dealing with an old building, it may well be listed, or certainly in a conservation area, there will be some degree of protection. This is the list description for my house, which is not only listed, it's grade 2-star listed in the top 5% of protected buildings in this country. It means that not only do I have to have the local authority conservation officer approval, Historic England also have to approve it, so extra hoops to jump through. And you need to know and understand this stuff to be able to get it right. There are two big misconceptions I come across all the time. The first is that the list description, which that is, tells you what it is that's protected about the building, which it doesn't. That's just there to describe the building so everybody knows what building we're talking about. Sometimes they're very detailed, sometimes they're very sketchy. Very often they only describe the outside of the building, which leads people to think it's only the outside of the building which is protected and not the inside. If a building's listed, all of the structure, everything outside and inside, is equally protected. Anything attached to the building is also protected. Any other structure within the curtilage, which basically means on the same plot, is also protected. And what that protection means is that you can't make any alterations without listed building consent. If you do, it's a criminal offence. It's not just planning law we're talking about, it's the criminal law. And there are significant sanctions up to and including imprisonment. So it's important that you understand what you're doing. There's a pub in West London where they finished about 6 months ago rebuilding it after it was demolished without listed building consent. And they were taken to court and they were forced to rebuild it brick by brick, which took them 4.5 years and cost 10 times what their original budget was for whatever it was they were planning to do when they knocked it down. So, it can go very badly wrong if you don't obey the rules. But the fact that you need consent to be able to make alterations doesn't mean you can't change anything, and that's the other big misconception. People think if the building's listed, you're never going to be able to do anything to it. Well, look at what I've been doing to my building, and that will show that that's definitely not the case. What you need to do is make sure you understand what you're doing to the building. The changes you're making are in the interest of the building, and they're improving it both in terms of its special historic interest, but also in terms of its fabric and structure and so on. And if you've done your research and you justify what you're doing, then you should get listed building consent to do it. And all that process is to a certain extent is to protect you as the owner of the building, to make sure that some bloke isn't coming along and destroying your building for you, as people have done a lot in the past without your knowledge and understanding. So it works both ways. It can be a bit of a pain, but also it's quite a significant protection for you as the owner as well as for the building itself. Evidence. The best starting point if you're trying to make changes in a building is collect some evidence in terms of why it's the right thing to do to the building. A picture of my house from 1974 shows what the windows in the building at that time were, which which had all been replaced by metal windows in about 1980. This tells us two things. First of all, the metal windows are modern, and that can be quite tricky because they're very difficult to date, metal windows, and 1920s and 1930s metal windows are regarded as really quite important. 1980s rubbish windows like we had aren't, but you need to be able to prove what they are. And also we can see what was there before. We can see that there were big sash windows all over in the ground floor. So with that evidence, we put in an application to reinstate the windows which had been there before and had been previously lost. And this application also changes the doors and replaces the cement render we had with a line render. Even if you're doing things which are obviously right, you still need to have consent for them. People sometimes get confused thinking, well, if you're making a controversial change, you obviously need consent. But if what you're doing is removing horribly damaging fabric and replacing it with something much better, you still need consent for that, because the process and the materials and the way it's done need to be carefully monitored. At the back of our house, there's an annex which was converted from some outbuildings in 1990 with listed building consent. It's in quite a bad state. Even worse, this 1970s, 1980s lean to extension, which was stuck on the back, which is an appalling condition. It really was falling down. This is quite common. You come across a building, part of our building 500 years old, they're absolutely fine. It's the stuff someone stuck on 50 years ago which is all falling down. Building standards in the middle of the 20th century were truly appalling, but very often the stuff which you really need to sort out is the modern stuff, not the old stuff. It can be an advantage to have something as bad as this stuck on your house, though, because no one is going to complain when you suggest change. Staircases can be quite tricky in our building. We inherited the horrendous staircase. It's kind of a strange double-winder staircase, and the bathroom was at the top of the second flight of stairs. So if you got up in the middle of the night, you have to stagger down the rickety staircase, which turn back the other way, and go up the other way. And if you survived there and back again, you were doing very well. So it was dangerous to use and also structurally unsound. So I said to the conservation officer when she came around, well, we obviously have to change this, we can't possibly use that staircase. And she said, well, I understand that, but staircases like that are a typical feature of these old Devon houses, so you have to keep it. So we thought long and hard, and eventually we came up with a plan where we could make a staircase out of cob. Cob is a readily available material where we are. It's a very typical local material in Devon. We're lucky we've got quite a big paddock, and I can dig out the paddock effectively what's already ready mixed cob. Just have to mix some straw in, water in with it, and I've got cob to build with. And it's a very flexible material, so we could cast around the old staircase, this new cob staircase. We've put timber bearers in order to take what are going to be oak treads and go on afterwards. Form the staircase out of cob. All we had to lose were those three unstable treads, which were going to have to be replaced anyway. And it worked really well. It's the only time I've ever come up with a solution, and I've gone to the conservation officer with it, and they've actually thanked me for the solution I've come to change they didn't want me to make. So this is the finished staircase. There are big, thick oak treads on top of the cob, a handrail. It's secured on the left-hand side as you look at it by a green oak screen, and then we've flared the treads out to the gutter, but also makes quite a nice design feature. Walls and ceilings. We inherited some horrible stuff. Lots of modern cement plaster, textured plaster, so all that had to come off. It came off, some of it in enormous sheets. It was really, really thick and heavy stuff. And then you get back to the basic structure, which in our house, downstairs is stone, rubble stone, and upstairs is cob. And then over that, we plastered all of that with clay plaster. Again, I'm lucky I've got a big source of clay on site, so I literally dug clay out of my paddock, mixed it with some sand and hair and water, and plastered onto the walls. So the supply chain for my plaster in most of my building is about 50 litres, which is very satisfying, it's very cheap, and it's obviously highly sustainable as well, so it's a really nice way of building. Clay plaster is magic stuff as well. Lime plaster is great, and it's really good for old buildings, and it's very breathable, and it buffers moisture and so on. Clay plaster is 10 times as good. Its moisture buffering capacity is extraordinary, very complex chemistry involved in clay and how, and it really is fantastic stuff, both for building health and for the health of occupants. If you can use clay plaster, then I would highly recommend it. Most people aren't lucky enough to have clay lying around in their garden like I have, but there are lots of proprietary mixes of clay plaster which you can source, and they're really good. It's really easy to apply, it's very forgiving. There was a dividing wall between the hallway and the sitting room, which was concrete blocks, and obviously a kind of modern insertion. When we were stripping the finishes off that, we found this oak beam across the top. The surviving head beam. We thought perhaps there was a timber screen in there, they're quite common in our area. So we popped out some blocks. Here is a line of mortises in the underside of the beam, which was proof that there had been a timber screen there in the past. With that evidence, we were able to get consent to reinstate the timber screen, so we built a new green oak screen in its place, which is obviously a huge improvement on the horrible concrete block wall that was there before. It's very easy, you look at something and think, well, how on earth are we going to fix that? You know, is this too much for us actually to manage to do? But there is always a solution. The thing to do is not panic, take your time, work out a good plan. You know, some fundamental things you have to do. You have to get out the modern, harmful material. You have to find some way of supporting the structure while you're doing it, and then rebuild it with appropriate materials which are going to be more compatible with the rest of the building. And if you work through that process step by step, then you should get a decent result. The floors, we had concrete floors, which someone had put in. Concrete basically either on the membrane or not, sometimes not on the membrane, straight on top of the earth. What I said it would do, water comes up, so they all had to come up, and then we wanted to excavate down below the floors in order to get an insulation and vapour barrier layer underneath our new floors. We found that the whole house is built straight onto bedrock, which is great in terms of having a really solid house which is never going to go anywhere. It's a pain when you have to excavate 300 millimetres in order to be able to get your insulation all through solid rock. So that was a lot of fun. We put a membrane down and we start to fill the floor with foam glass aggregate. This is great stuff. I mean, it's basically recycled windscreens, mostly from Germany. It comes in kind of irregular cuboids, and you can spread them out and then you compress them with a whacker plate, and they all interlock, and it gives you effectively a structural floor slab. They're insulating. They also create a capillary barrier to moisture. You know, I was saying the basic alternatives in an old house are either you have water evaporating up through your floor, or you have a vapour barrier which is going to squirt water into the side of your walls. Well, this is the halfway point between the two. So water tries to rise through the layer of foam glass, and it rises by kind of capillary action, and is constantly fighting against gravity. And at some point within the depth, gravity wins over the capillary action and the hydrostatic pressure, and then it starts to fall again. So you get this kind of buffering effect within the layer. So you don't get the squirting sideways, but you also don't get water coming up, evaporating through your floors, which is a bit of a pain for modern living, and it moves the carpet rot and those kind of things. So it's a really good compromise. On top of that, we put on floor heating, and then screed, or actually that floor, and cold floor straight over the top of that. The house had almost no electrical or plumbing installation, and we had to change nearly everything, or rip stuff out and reinstate it. So this is the start of our new electrical installation. That floor that we threw over the top of the main bedroom area proved to be a real benefit, because service routes in old buildings are really hard to find, because when they built them you didn't have cables going everywhere, pipes going everywhere and so on. So if you can create a floor ceiling void, half the cables, and following those there are an awful lot of pipes in there as well. And all led back to a plant where you've got the new consumer unit, and also our council's heat pump is going in there, and all of the plumbing runs off there as well. The bathroom, which was in the corner of that bedroom, which was a highly undesirable bathroom, so all that was ripped out. To stud work forming that bathroom and the new ceiling, we lined all of that with woodwork boards that I described before. The external walls of this area, we actually had quite a lot of surviving lime plaster, which had been messed about and patched with cement and all sorts of other stuff. So all we did was remove the dodgy patches, patch repair with lime plaster, and really just fill in the gaps, and then we've decorated over the top of that, which has retained most of the original lime plaster. It gives us a kind of fairly uneven finish, but actually in an old house, that's a better look than a perfectly lovely, smooth, straight, square plastered wall. and works really well. We're very pleased with that. We've painted it with earthborne plate paint, which is great stuff. It's highly breathable, it has 0 VOCs, a very wide colour range, it's really nice paint to use. Thermal efficiency in old buildings, as I said, is a critical factor, particularly now with the price of electricity and climate change being a major issue. Trying to make our buildings as thermally efficient as possible is very important. Now, all buildings get a very bad press. That's largely because the systems we use for assessing thermal efficiency don't really work very well when they're applied to old buildings, so you get erroneous results. A dry old building, if you sorted out all of those issues I was talking about before, which tend to make the walls wet, generally has the potential to be quite thermally efficient and quite well. The problem is keeping it dry. Places where once you've done that you're going to be losing heat in old buildings around the windows and doors and through the roof. I know the same places for all buildings. If it was a 1960s, 1970s building, it would be considerably worse. And the biggest problems with doors and windows tend to be around the doors and windows rather than through. Airtightness and draft stripping and so on are the most important things to do. If you can make all the doors and windows airtight, that's the biggest change. You lose more heat that way than through the windows. And then you can look at the actual glazing itself. Secondary glazing tends to be a better option in old buildings rather than changing all the windows to double glazing. If you don't need to change the windows or if they're in good condition, then you shouldn't be changing it. You need to find other ways of doing it. We have changed windows from front to door to the ones, but because it's two-star listed, we can't have double glazing, so we've got single glaze sash windows. But they're very well draft stripped. We then have shutters as well to further increase the thermal performance. And actually we get pretty good results. Historic England, when they were English Heritage, did a big survey looking at reconditioned sash windows with shutters and with thermally aligned curtains. And they found if you do that well, they were getting better results than with modern double glazed units. So, you know, the most obvious solution, which is rip out your windows and put double glazing in, isn't necessarily the best answer, either for thermal performance or for what you're doing to the building. Insulating the roof, as with all buildings, is absolutely critical. You can't have too much insulation in your roof space. The important thing is the material that you use. The modern fiberglass material doesn't work very well because it doesn't strip moisture out of the warm air which is coming up through the insulation. What we call hygroscopic materials, they're generally natural materials. You can see there, hemp, sheep's wool, wood fibre, sisal, all these natural materials, they can absorb water vapour as the warm air is coming up and hitting your insulation. If you don't do that, you can get condensation in the roof, and then all of your valuable historic roof structure can start to rot. And you can certainly get worm damage. Finally, we have solid floors in our house. If you have suspended timber floors, what you can do if you can lift the boards is you can drape a membrane over and between the joists and fill the space with insulation material. Loose fill cellulose insulation. Warm Sand is the best known brand name of it. It's very good. It's also very cheap, unlike the last insulation I was telling you about. And this will work really well. If you want, you can put then underfloor heating over the top of that, and then you have a warm, well-insulated floor. The final thing to look at is a heat source. We were able to install a ground source heat pump because we have a big paddock, and that's giving us nice, constant, low temperature heating, which is very efficient, far more efficient than having conventional heating with a gas boiler.